Go to Jeremiah chapter 4. Jeremiah 4. This is a good one. Jeremiah 4. This next set of verses is one of the major verses that are used by gap theorists to teach their theory. Jeremiah, and you're going to see why. I got it on my notes, but I'm going to turn it in my own Bible. Jeremiah 4, verse 23. And you're going to see very quickly why this is a strong argument for the gap theory. Jeremiah 4, look at verse 23. Look at me when you get there. Jeremiah 4, verse 23. All right, look at verse number 23. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, they had no light. Now, what in the world is Jeremiah referring to? It's obvious what he's referring to. Genesis 1, verse 2. He saw the earth, it was without form and void, just like Genesis 1, 2 says. And the heavens, they had no light, because it's in the third verse that he says, let there be light. So obviously he is referring to Genesis 1, verse number 2. So here's how they read this. Jeremiah is looking at the point in time when Genesis 1, 2 was taking place. He's looking back thousands of years at creation or the after the judgment of God on the original creation. And verse 24, here's what he sees. When he looks at the world in Genesis 1, 2, here's what he sees. Verse 4, I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man. Of course not, they've all been destroyed by a flood. And all the birds of the heavens were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord, and by his fierce anger, because of that judgment that took place in Genesis 1, 2. Y'all see that? You can see why gap theorists would believe that. They believe that there was a civilization, and the flood of Genesis 1, 2 destroyed the mountains and the hills and the men and the birds and the fruitful place and so on and so forth. Sounds like a good solid argument, doesn't it, for the gap theory? Well, let's look at these verses. Let's break them down. Let's look and see is that what Jeremiah is talking about. Verse 23 again. He says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, they had no light. Clearly, he's referring to Genesis 1, 2. He's using that verse. Either he's looking at that point in time when Genesis 1, 2 took place, or he's just using the terminology from that time. Let's see which one it is. Verse 24. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. Now, wait a minute. He just said he saw it when it was without form and void. That means shapeless. How in the world are there mountains and hills on a shapeless planet? So automatically that makes me think he's not looking at Genesis 1, 2. He's using words out of Genesis 1, 2 to describe whatever he's describing. Look at verse number, verse 25. I beheld, and lo, there was no man. And that one could be used because they teach that all the men were destroyed with the flood. That pre-Adamite civilization was destroyed with the flood. So there's no men left. But the problem is the next part of the verse. And all the birds of the heavens were fled. They didn't die. They fled. If you flee someplace, that means you go someplace else. If this is a worldwide flood that destroyed all things, there's no place else to go. They're not going to fly through oxygenless space and get to another planet. They're dead. The verse says the birds are running away, not that they died. Do you see that? Well, they have a problem there. And then verse 26. And I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness. Now, wait a minute. The fruitful place was a wilderness. What is a wilderness like? If you're taking notes, write this verse down. I'm not going to make you turn there. Just write the verse down. You can use this later. Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 13. Zephaniah 2, verse 13. I'm going to read it to you, so listen carefully. God's passing judgment here. He says, and he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria and will make Nineveh. God's going to make Nineveh, Zephaniah says, a desolation and dry like a wilderness. So a wilderness is a dry place. Could you please tell me in Genesis 1 verse number 2 what was dry on planet Earth? Anybody? Nothing. It was all encompassed in water. What day did dry something show up? Day 3, dry land appeared. Now Jeremiah's quoting Genesis 1 verse 2. Dry land's not here. There is no wilderness in Genesis 1 verse 2 because a wilderness is a dry place, not a soaking wet place. You say, well, what in the world is he talking about? Well, look at verse number 27. For thus hath the Lord said, the whole land shall be desolate, yet will I not make a full end. Who's he talking about when he says the land? Israel. He's just talking about Israel. This is what's called hyperbole. Jeremiah is using hyperbole, meaning he's using exaggeration to describe a certain circumstance. He's looking at God's judgment on the land of Israel. He said it's so bad, it's like it was without form and void, but it still has mountains and birds and so on and so forth. It's just a judgment on Israel. He's using hyperbole. Clearly, he's not looking at Genesis 1-2. So he's not looking at pre-Adamite cities and pre-Adamite men and pre-Adamite birds. He's looking at the land of Israel. Is that clear? Did everybody understand that? That seems clear to me. That he's certainly not describing a gap theory.